We are starting, this is the first night of an Old Testament survey. Melissa did the New Testament survey earlier in the year, and that was really interesting. I got a lot out of that. And we're going to work on the Old Testament now. I have Carmen's passed out some handouts for me, and we'll talk about those a little later as we go through them. There are a general outline in there of what I'm going to be talking about. It's not exactly the same as what I'm going to say, but close. Okay. Have you ever heard that phrase, I'm a New Testament Christian? I've said that phrase, you know, and I meant it to say, I'm free in Jesus, you know. I'm not bound by the law, but I've got grace on my side. I follow the ways of Jesus and I'm excited about it. That's what I wanted to say. But more times than not, what it really was saying is, I'm afraid of the Old Testament. I don't know what it means. I don't know how the New Testament and the Old Testament fit together. The Old Testament looks like a bunch of laws and it looks scary. And Jesus is all about love. And what I was probably really saying with I'm a New Testament Christian is I'm going to ignore that Old Testament. The first time I talked about something from the Old Testament, there was a few people that almost walked out on me because they didn't know why they needed any of that stinking Old Testament. You know? I don't think those were the words they used, but no, those weren't the words you're thinking there weren't the ones they used either. So, okay. It's probably a good idea to start off as a New Testament Christian. We need to read those first four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to find out who Jesus is, to find out about his life, his death, and his resurrection. We need the book of Acts to find out about the history of the church and how it got started. We need the epistles to know who we are in Christ, what this new creature is, how we're to act and think, what we're to do, what our behavior is, what do we look like. You know, we're something new now. We're this thing called a Christian, and what is that? Why is that different from what I was before? And that's great. It is great to start off as a New Testament Christian. But then you get to Revelation. And that book gets a little puzzling. And by the way, you may have passed through Hebrews, where it compared Jesus to Moses and the priesthood. And if you don't know who Moses is, and what he was to the Jewish people, and how Jesus is better than that. And if you don't know what the priesthood was, and how Jesus is now our high priest, you miss some of what they're saying. You lose some of what the author is trying to communicate about Christ. As I read my Bible as my New Testament, Christian, I kept running into things where it was clear the author and his audience understood in a few words something significant, but I wasn't getting it. My husband has some friends that have been friends since they were in their 20s, so 40, 50 years ago. And they would make jokes like purple toenails and run away, run away. And everybody laughs. And I then spend the next day or two asking just, what did you mean by that? How did that work in with what they were saying then, you know? Well, I started feeling that way more and more in the New Testament. What do you mean by that? You know, how does that work, right? So, one of the reasons why we study the Old Testament is to have a better understanding of the New. There's a saying that the new is concealed in the old, and the old is revealed in the new. And we find that out as we work through our teaching, that we'll see how that applies. During this survey of the Old Testament, we will not fully learn the Old Testament. I don't pretend to begin to think that I know the Old Testament. I don't. There's just a lot there. Yeah. But I hope to give you some information that'll help you in your study of the Old Testament and help some of that confusion between, am I supposed to act the Old Testament way or the New Testament way? How do these two work together? Because there's times when we get confused by what they've done in the Old Testament and what they're doing in the New, and how does this work out? You know, how does it fit together? Our starting point will be the books. In the Old Testament, there are 39 books. In the whole Bible, there are 66. In your handout, after the outline, the first sheet there is the books of the Bible, library of 66 books. And if you look at them, they're organized into the first 5 books. It says the law. The next books say history. I don't have a copy. Do I have a copy here so I can look at it, make sure I've got it right? Yeah, I do. I've got it. And then the next is poetry, major prophets and minor prophets. The first 5 books, the law, is God setting down through Moses the instructions for the Jewish people on how to be a nation. Genesis is a history of God's dealing with creation, creating man, dealing with men, and then getting ready, setting up so that he could create a nation of people, his chosen people. Exodus is the story of bringing those people out of Egypt and making them a nation. And then the next 3 books are the laws, the rules, the governance. The history books are the history of that nation. The poetry books, some interesting poetry, and we'll talk about them, and we'll talk about how Jewish poetry differs from English poetry. First of all, they don't rhyme their words like we do. It's going to be interesting. And it talks about the major prophets and the minor prophets. I don't like that distinction. What they're really saying is these guys wrote longer or lived longer than these other guys did. That's not necessarily always the case. We'll look at those a little later on. You know. So we have the books of the law. We have the books of the Old Testament. When I would read them, I would get confused because they aren't organized in storytelling order. They're organized in these clumps of types of books. So the next thing you have in there is a very long handout. It says the Bible timeline. And your center column is a short description of an event, such as in the beginning was the Word. The next one, the creation. On your left-hand column is about the time this happened. And in your right-hand column is the books of the Bible that is talked about in or fit in. And if you notice, we go through Genesis 1 through 10 here, then all of a sudden Job pops in. And then we go back to Genesis again. it took me a long time to realize that old Job was around a long time before I thought he was, you know. I read different chronologies. Some put Job in before Genesis. Some put him in about after a few chapters in. Some put him in a little later. And we'll talk about that when we get to the book of Job. I hope that I'll have a better understanding of that. I'm working on it. You know, but he is a very early understanding of who God is. And sometimes when we read Job, we lose that. We don't realize that these were people sitting around who really didn't know God very well. And they're speculating about him with the we know it all attitude that we often get. You know? So we've talked about the books and the timeline. The next thing we want to talk about a little bit is language. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew. The New Testament was written in Greek. Now this is the part where my eyes begin to sparkle a little bit and I get a little excited. The choice of languages, I think, is one of God's clues as to the relationship of the Old Testament and the New Testament. Greek is a very precise language. I've heard that it's the most precise language ever used by man. I've been listening to some of Rick Reiner's teachings lately, and he keeps going and says, now this Greek word means specifically this and nothing else, and this Greek word means specifically this, you know. And it's really interesting. He was talking the other night about the little naked boy when Jesus was being taken away from Gethsemane and where he came from, and the linen cloth, the word there used, could only mean this kind of cloth made in Egypt, brought over and used only for burial of rich people. It's like, okay, so this little boy who's running around naked is not Mark, he's not John, he's a recently dead kid who's brought back to life. When the soldiers came to take Jesus and said, who is he? And Jesus says, I am. And the soldiers fell down. This is the outpouring of that power of God that also raised a little boy. You don't know that unless you know the Greek. Melissa is really good in her teaching of going back and defining Greek words for us. Not because we don't know the English words, but because we don't know the Greek words. And their precision has such interesting things in them. Hebrew, on the other hand, is a language of broad concepts. Take the word shalom. I gotta make sure I read my notes for this one. We sometimes use shalom as hi and hello and goodbye. And the simple meaning is peace. One definition, a more accurate definition, one dictionary gave it completeness, soundness, welfare, friendship, perfect peace. That's a lot more than what I think hi and bye, you know. Another dictionary gave it to be safe, sound, healthy, perfect, complete, signifies a sense of well-being and harmony both within and without. Completeness, wholeness, peace, health, welfare, safety, soundness, tranquility, prosperity, fullness, rest, harmony, the absence of agitation or discord, a state of calm without anxiety or stress. All of that from one word. Broad concepts. In the New American Standard Bible, shalom was translated into 30 different English words. And each one had a specific and clear meaning. Shalom basically is saying, I want you to have complete and total peace. Such peace that your household is prosperous. You and your family are in excellent health. You have no arguments or disagreements with anyone. Not with your kids, not with your spouse, not with your in-laws, not with your next door neighbor, not with that guy who lives in another country and worships another God. That's what I want for you to have when I say shalom to you. Such a complete and utter and total peace that your whole world is in complete and perfect harmony. There is no Greek word that's going to say all that. Just ain't going to happen. It's interesting in Hebrew that even the letters have significance. Now I'm going to put my thing down and pick up a marker for a minute. Have I written cot or cat?
Neither.
Could be either one. One of the nice things about Hebrew is that each letter not only has a sound meaning, it also has a word meaning. I can't give you the letter right now, but there's one that's an ox originally, and it's strength, But they also have a numeric meaning. So that if we translate these into numeric values,
3.
we see that CAT would have the value of 3, 1, 20, a total of 24. That COT would have the value of 3, 15, and 20, or the value of 38. Now, I'm just giving arbitrary numbers for our English words. Our English letters do not have numeric value, but the Hebrew letters do. Why is this important? Because if you're trying to transcribe this sentence, or a sentence with this word in it, and you're wanting to do it thousands of times over thousands of years, if you can know that, okay, this word is going to have a value of 24, oh, I transcribed it and I have a value of 38, something's wrong somewhere. What a wonderful way of using a language that would help carry the accuracy down through the centuries. I think that's part of the reason why God invented Hebrew, is so that we'd have that accuracy. With Hebrew, again, I'm not a Hebrew scholar at all, but it's my understanding most words start off with a base 3 letters. And then when you add another letter to that word, it makes a new word. But the new word ties in meaning to the old word. Now, in English, take the word cat, add an H to it, and get the word chat. Those words have no meaning in relationship to each other at all. But in Hebrew, when you add a letter, it does have its significance. Melissa talked about this when she talked about God's being both male and female, and how it takes both the letters in the name for male and the letters for the name in female in Hebrew to indicate the nature of God in that union. Only Hebrew does that. In Hebrew, you have a wide assortment of things that it's trying to convey, a broad concept. And in Greek, you have specifics. In the Old Testament, you have broad stories. But in the New Testament, you have more specifics. There are hidden significance in a lot of the Hebrew words. They're beginning to find that out as they look through using the letters and finding the letters. I think you'll hear it called the Hebrew code or the Genesis code sometimes. There's more and more significance in some of those letters and in the words and the word choices than what we realize. Yeah. But that goes back to our saying. The New Testament is in the Old concealed, and the Old is in the New revealed.
Mm-hmm.
An example of this concept of how the Old Testament has a broad concept that the New Testament reveals is in the story of Abraham. If you would turn to Genesis 22, verses 1 through 12.
Can you repeat it again? Can you repeat that again?
Genesis
Teachers.
22, verses 1 through 12. It'll be on your outline. The first page, front and back, is the outline. That's what we're talking about. Every page behind that is additional information or additional materials. As we're reading this, I want you to do something for me. I want you to go back in your imagination. You're not living in the present day. Jesus hasn't come. You are an Israelite. You walk pretty well everywhere you go. You have been taught the Old Testament. Well, am I going that far back? Let me see my notes. Yeah. It's okay, Eric. I'll get it later. And you read this story. You picked up your scrolls and you're reading this story. Genesis 22, starting at verse 1. And it came to pass that after these things, I'm reading out of King James, that God did tempt Abraham and said unto him, Abraham? And he said, Behold, I'm here. And he said, Take now thy son, thy only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of the Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. And Abraham rose up early in the morning, and saddled his ass, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up, and went into the place which God had told him. Then on the third day Abraham lifted up his eyes, and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said unto his young man, Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son. He took the fire in his hand and a knife, and they both of them went together. You're reading this story. Okay, he's got fire. He's got wood. He's got a knife. Where is the offering? You know, being a good Jewish person, that a sheep or a goat will work, an ox will work, a dove will work. They've got to be perfect. Where's the offering? Okay, let's keep reading. And Isaac spoke unto his father and said, My father. And he said, Here am I, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Oh, Isaac's wondering the same thing you are. Okay. And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for the burnt offering. So they went both of them together, and they came to the place which God had told them of. And Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, and he took the knife to slay his son. Wait a minute, hold on. God really, really likes life. I mean, I'm a good Jewish person, and I know if I accidentally kill someone, I've got to run over to one of these cities of sanctuary and prove that I didn't do it on purpose. And then I've got to stay in that city as long as anyone from that guy's family is alive. Because God really respects life. God, you do not kill. That's one of the top 10, bud. You don't kill. This doesn't sound right. My God does not go around telling people to go kill their children. Other gods do, but not mine. And, hey, wait a minute. This Isaac here. This was the kid who Abraham and Sarah had after they had stopped, what it takes to make kids. They had both gotten too old for that kind of hanky-panky anymore. This was the one God promised him would everything would come out of. Wait a minute. Whoa. What's going on here? So you're sitting back and you're reading these scriptures and you're going, okay, this is what Abraham did. Why? What's this all about, God? God doesn't tell you much about it in the Old Testament other than this is what happened. Okay. Your imagination. Move forward. You're still a Hebrew. But now, there's this rabbi who's been walking around the countryside talking to people. The story is he's healing folks. He's even doing those miracles that the Old Testament said only the Messiah could do. I mean, he's saying things like, I am. God said, I am. To Moses at the burning bush. What's this Hebrew, this little rabbi doing things like that? And then you hear about his death and his resurrection. Now, when you go back and read the story of Abraham, that's what God the Father was doing. Jesus was his son. Jesus is the Messiah. God the Father is bringing his only son for a sacrifice. Abraham didn't have to go through that sacrifice, but God the Father went through it. He gave his only son. Now, the story of Abraham begins to make sense. Jesus was dead for 3 days before he rose again. The story of Noah and that fish, That's beginning to make some sense now. The whole thing with Noah and the ark, that's beginning to make some sense now that Jesus is here. Okay, move on forward in time. Now you're a 16-year-old girl. Sorry, I just got emotional. I apologize for that, because this girl's me. She's a Christian. She hasn't read a whole lot of the New Testament yet. Her family took her to Sunday school, so she knows all these Old Testament stories. But what Abraham and Isaac? What in the world was Abraham thinking when he took Isaac up there? How do you get enough trust in God to work yourself up to take your only son and then have enough trust in God to not go through with it, but to use the ram that's caught in the thicket? Folks, this one puzzled me a long time. Okay, where's our next scripture? Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11, verses 17 through 19. All right. This time I'm going to read out of the NIV. Is everyone there?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. Okay, I can see how by faith he would offer his son. Okay. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Okay, he's embraced this promise that Isaac is going to bring these stars of children and this sand of children. Again, here's my question. What in the world was he thinking, 19. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. There's my answer. Abraham believed God would raise Isaac out of the dead. I didn't see that anywhere in the Old Testament, but I see that in the New. The New Testament is in the Old, concealed. The Old is in the New, revealed. Now I know. Now I know. The Old Testament has levels of meaning. As you read through the Old Testament, keep in mind it's both a history of how people were called out by God, how he brought through people and then worked into a nation to reveal himself to the world. But it's also a foreshadowing, a preview of the New Testament. The main subject of both the Old Testament and the New Testament is Jesus. In the Old Testament, we give examples of what to look for so that when he came, we would recognize him. We have the story of Abraham to prepare us for God sacrificing his own son. We have the story of Jonah and being in that belly of that whale 3 days to know that he was going to be dead for 3 days. But don't give up hope. He's going to come back. We had the story of Joseph and his life that speaks of Jesus. We have all these stories that hint, that foreshadow, that indicate Jesus. Jesus is concealed in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, but he's revealed in the New Testament. Okay, that brings me to another one of my questions. I question the Bible a lot, and I question God frequently. Why isn't the Old Testament quoted more in the New, if that's what's happening here, you know? At the time of Jesus, Greek was the language of the world. And at that time, the Old Testament had been translated into Greek. It's called the Septuagint. And that translation was being used by most people. So when they are referencing it in the New Testament, most often they're referencing the Septuagint or the Greek translation. Our New Testaments, most of them went back to the original Hebrew to translate. It's like the kids in Sunday. One kid had a King James Bible and another one had New American Standard, and neither one was sure that they had the same translation because the wording was just a little different, just enough to throw it off. And I think that was one of the things that's happened with our Old Testament, New Testament. There's another document you have in your packet, percentage of the Old Testament found in the New Testament. It's going to be the very last page. I was excited to find this, and I was surprised to find this. Hebrews. Hebrews has got 69% Old Testament references. 69% of that book is taken from the Old Testament, either a quote or an illustration or a referral back to it. There are 303 verses in Hebrews, and 210 of them have references to the Old Testament. Remember how puzzled I got as a girl reading Revelation? Aha, look at that one. It's got 150%. Out of 404 verses that are in the book, 605 references to the Old Testament. No wonder I don't understand Revelation. I don't know enough of the Old Testament to figure out what they're talking about. You know? I found this to be a really interesting document. I really believe that the translational difference is one of the big reasons why we do not necessarily pick up on the illustrations of the Old Testament, the quotes or the references. That and a lack of knowledge of the Old Testament. One of the questions that I meant to mention earlier and I didn't was when you look at those 39 books, if you were raised Catholic, you had some other books. Why aren't they included? Well, now is what I'm going to talk about, why they're not included. Those are called the Apocrypha. Most of them were written around 200 BC, which is 200 years before Christ. The last book we have in what we consider the Old Testament was written over 400 years before Christ. The books in the Apocrypha were not recognized as scripture until over 1,500 years after Jesus. They were never accepted by the Jewish community as part of the scriptures. They were accepted as interesting stories, but not necessarily as part of the scriptures.
Your hand needs to go up closer.
My hand needs to go up. Okay. Thank you. And, when we looked at that percentages just now of how much that was referenced, none of the books in the Apocrypha are referenced in the New Testament. None of them. That one alone makes me comfortable thinking that's probably not something I need to spend my time studying. And that's why the Protestant community has not included those books in the scriptures. They're not referenced by Jesus. Everything else was in some way or another. They're not quoted in any other book. Now, plus, there's some doctrines in those that are not supported any place else in the scriptures, such as purgatory. That doctrine is only pulled out of these books from the Apocrypha. You do not find them anywhere else. Okay. I mentioned before that the Old Testament is a history, and it is. But it's a history of fallen, imperfect people. Just because the heroes of the Old Testament did something, that didn't make the behavior right. You have a lot of them. Abraham, David, Solomon, who married multiple wives. In the New Testament, it's clear that it's one man, one wife. Yeah. God had said it back in Genesis. When he introduced Eve to Adam. But there's a guy called Lamech in there who thought it'd be a nice idea to have two. And then, we started getting more of that nice idea. But when you read the Old Testament, you also see the heartache, the problems that this brought. Yeah. So when you're reading the Old Testament heroes, remember they are fallen, imperfect people. Go to the New Testament to find out if what you're seeing there is a valid principle or not. Many of the people and events in the Old Testament have both a historic significance. In other words, these people lived, these things happened, but they're also patterns and shadows for the New Testament. And they often can be read as an extended parable. What do I mean by extended parable? You have the Israelites who came out of Egypt and they're entering the promised land. God gave them their land. That was their land. But they had to fight to have possession of it. We, as new believers, new creatures in Christ, have the promises of God. When we're born again, we have all of his promises. But we still have to fight to make them valid in our lives, to have them acted out, to live in them. That's what I mean by an extended parable. What they went through is very often a parable of what we're going to go through. If you have people in the Old Testament struggling with a problem over and over again, then there's still going to be that struggle for men to be happy with just one wife. It's going to be a struggle we're going to have to deal with in the New Testament too, as new creatures. When we have an understanding of the old, the new becomes richer in meaning. And we can find examples in the Old of how to handle or not handle situation today. There's lots of prime examples of how husband and wives work together or communicate or work out problems in the Old Testament. There's also lots of examples of how not to do it. King David is a wonderful example of a man who goes before God and says, God, I messed up. I blew it, forgive me. But he's also a very bad example of a father. And the destruction that comes on his family because he won't deal with the problems within his own family. When one of his sons rapes a half-sister, and David won't do anything about it, and the whole brothers of that sister are angry and bitter and can't do anything because Dad has turned a blind eye. Read the Old Testament, find out what happened. It's a great book for finding examples of both the good and the bad. The old without the new is incomplete. Jesus says in Matthew 11:27, all things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father. No one knows the Father except the Son. And those to whom the I don't know why I'm so tongue-tied tonight. I think it's that camera. But anyway, no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal himself. The Old Testament is the beginning of the Father. We find out a lot about God, but we don't really see God until we see Jesus. We don't see that much of what the Father does in the Old Testament is out of love until we see Jesus. The revelation of who and what Jesus is only becomes clear in the New Testament. The revelation of God grows and grows in the Old Testament, but that revelation cannot be complete and accurate until the revelation of Jesus Christ. I truly believe our survey of the Old Testament is going to be fun. I'm really excited about it, guys. I keep finding interesting things like percentages of Old Testament and New. I keep finding wonderful things, and it's going to be a really good thing. It's my goal to bring you a solid basis for exploring the Old Testament, and hopefully to help deal with some of that confusion. But if in the meantime you're reading the Old Testament and it's getting you a little confused, go to the New Testament to find your doctrine. Read the Old Testament as a history. Look to see if there might be some parallels to the New Testament. But take your doctrine out of the New Testament. If you want to give me some questions about the Old Testament that you've had, please write them out or send them an email. I do much better if they're written down. I'll keep track of them better. I will be glad to try to work answers into this survey. It's going to take us a while to get through the Old Testament. And the questions you ask, there's probably someone else wanting to ask the same question, but not as bold as you are or as confident to ask. So go ahead and ask. Eric, stop the recording, please. You can start again now. Okay.